because we are, as Jason will talk about, in a severe water crisis in the state, right? Compounded by the recent drought, compounded by all these other factors, and understanding what to me is an extremely successful case of using recycled water in an agricultural system, which to me, we hear a lot about recycled water from a public perspective, right? Whether the public's willing to accept recycled water for drinking water. So this is kind of a different level in some ways, right? It might be easier to kind of first start off by thinking about let's use recycled water in other applications. And here you have, through what I've learned from Jason, what I see as the most successful use of recycled water in agriculture in the country or the world maybe, which we don't see. So it wasn't immediately clear why Jason was interested in this thing when he was talking to me about it, but it became abundantly clear after a little bit of time with this. So so I'm really excited to hear what he has to say today, and for you guys to learn what he's learned a little bit through this process. Jason in his time here also has developed some photography skills from what I understand between his work through the Spartan Daily, doing sporting events and things like that, but also through a lot of wildlife photography as well, which I've seen at least 2 pictures that over time, I think, in the 115 room kind of circulate through, like Gary Lee likes to circulate his photography students' work through our own kind of experiences in day-to-day work. So beyond that, one thing that Jason also has in common with at least 2 of his committee members, we're all on the same campus at the same time. Dr. Gershenson and myself were starting graduate school in the fall of 2001, and I'm guessing Jason was off in the redwoods hiking around or doing something because he graduated in 2002. So we never crossed paths then, but just to know that we were all on the same campus at the same time, I think is a kind of neat little factoid to put in there. But without further ado, since I've already taken up enough time from being late, I'll hand it over to Jason. So let's give him a warm applause.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mulvaney, and welcome everyone. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and see the presentation of my Master's Defense, San Jose State University. Today I brought a little something. I think we all know what this is. Don't need to explain that one. The main thing that brought this, besides myself, is water. Without water, there are no strawberries. Without water, there are no crops. So, and as we're all aware, we're in California, we're most likely all local. We're aware of the California drought. It's been happening the last few years, and the global water crisis. The title of my research, Growers' Attitudes Towards Using Recycled Water to Mitigate Seawater Intrusion. This is a case study of the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project. It's known as CSIP. It's a successful program using recycled water to mitigate seawater intrusion. And so a few things I researched was the underlying factors of the program's success, growers' attitudes and perceptions of recycled water being used on their land, their views toward alternative water sources, and I also examined their perceptions of environmental concerns and the impacts that those sources, that it takes for those sources to get to them, and also the effects that it has on seawater intrusion. Now, I want to check the lighting. Is this? That's great. Okay. Yeah, it was a little intense there. So, with that, I'd like to get started on the presentation. So, first off, I'm going to start with some of the big picture problems and background. These are very complex things, so I'm going to be very brief on it, but I want to give a little background so we're all on the same page when they come up, because these themes are going to come up continuously through my talk. Global climate change. I'm sure we've all heard about it. We've all seen some of the effects. Basically, there currently is rising temperatures and sea level rise throughout, and there's going to be, and there is, sporadic and unpredictable rainfall that's happening all over. This is not just to my site. Now here, as you saw from the title, seawater intrusion, I'm going to go over the diagram. This basically explains what that process is, so you can kind of follow along as I'm doing it, as I'm giving the talk. Here you have, basically you're along the coast, so that's where the seawater is. As water's being pulled up, whether it's from agriculture, or it's for agriculture or urban use, it pulls the water up from the underground basin, drawing in the water, and as that happens and the seawater pushes in, you get what's called intrusion. It's coming into the water. Well, major problem with that is, well, the water gets too saline to be used to drink or to be used on crops. And part of the water cycle is the rainfall and percolation coming down, and with the drought, there's less of that. So you have less replenishment of the water as well as the drought. So that exacerbates the entire process. Now with that, one of the remedies that's been put forth is groundwater recharge. Essentially you have the same exact diagram you just saw, except now you have an injection well where you inject water back in, and you do it before wherever that seawater intrusion has got to, so you push it back. And eventually, hopefully, you can have more wells and get farther out. Now, generally, what's used with that is another source, because it wouldn't make sense to draw up water and put it back down. So generally, you use recycled water, or you use another alternative source to replenish the water, because the whole problem is it's being drawn up faster than it being replenished from the water cycle, like I had mentioned. Now, California drought. We're all aware of that. I'm not going to go into that too deep. We've been living it the last few years. It's just less water. Now, one of the things that this is, one of the catalysts for the drought is recent legislation about groundwater management. The drought has opened up for more problems with the whole water cycle that I just went through, where you have more water coming up than areas going down. So the governor's signed the legislation, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, that's going to be throughout my talk. And Department of Water Resources is the agency that oversees the implementation of this, and it's still fairly new, and there's still current stuff going on right now, so it's all kind of fresh, but it's all underway. Things have already been signed, things are already in motion, and we're moving forward on that. Now, two of the major water management strategies, I'm sure we've all heard, especially water conservation. Well, that one's pretty easy. It's you use less, you're more efficient. That's, pretty self-explanatory. Water reuse is essentially just using its own title. You're reusing water. So it could be in the form of recycled water, where it's wastewater that goes to a treatment plant, gets treated to the quality that's desired, and then sent through the distribution system. Or you can have gray water collection, and there's multiple other ways, but it's just reusing water. And really, you get down to it, we're all reusing water all the time. We're not really creating new water. It's just we're speeding up the process because we have so many people and so many uses. We just need the water. Now, with that said, this brings about some of the alternative supplies. Well, the two most well-known is desalination and recycled water. Well, with that comes some controversy. It's not as easy as just the normal water you turn open on a tap. Salinization is seen as environmentally unfriendly, has high energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions from that process, and the discharge of the concentrated salts, known as brine, that is the leftover from that process. When you add all that up, it creates a higher cost. So now that's another factor on top of that that is a deterrent for that use or for that process. Now, recycled water is seen as a public health hazard. As I mentioned before briefly, it's wastewater that goes to a treatment plant, it's treated, and it goes out into whatever distribution system that we're talking about. Well, there's all that bacteria, there's all those things that's in the wastewater, and there's the fear that that's going to get bypassed in the treatment. Well, nobody wants that. And especially in this day and age, you got more chemicals, you got more pharmaceuticals, you have so many things in that water, in the wastewater, that you don't want. That's why it's in the sewer and it's going away from you. So those fears are some setbacks, but just to give you a brief rundown of what's behind, because these are two of the main water sources that I'm going to be discussing throughout this entire talk. Now, with that said, I'm just going to do a quick review of some of the literature that I looked at, and to give a better feel for all the factors I'm looking at, and looking at, on this particular side, we're looking at we're looking at the public's perception and the end user's attitude regarding the implementation of new sources being used. And those become limiting factors. Well, in my case, the end user is the grower. Well, the grower's attitude definitely is important, and actually the public's perception is important for the water that they use, because they're using it on the crops that they're actually going to buy. So that affects them in the market. So they both go hand in hand. Now, with growers' acceptance, well, the reliability of that water supply, whatever it may be, and the water quality levels are very important with the acceptance of the growers. And all of my research supports this, and supports the public perception. Now, with that, looking at the communication. Well, the communication between the program itself, whichever system you're talking about, has to start early in the process. They got to get the growers involved. They got to maintain that. They got to hear them. They got to, keep them basically in the loop. And with that, trust grows with it. And they both go hand in hand, just like the visual shows. It's hand in hand. Without the communication and trust, well, people just really start losing interest and don't really like it. So that is something that I found to be true within my research as well. So all of that correlates. With that, flip that a little fast, but so you have time to read it here. Brings us to my first research question. What factors influence growers' acceptance of alternative water supplies? We're gonna be hearing a lot of those reasons as we're going, and I'm going to wrap it up at the end. And I have a second research question, which is, how does growers' level of concern regarding seawater intrusion and environmental impact affect their attitudes toward different water supply options? So it's looking behind the scenes. What's their level of concern with those decisions? Now, objectives of my research. I wanted to investigate the current attitudes of the growers that are at CSIP, evaluate the factors that influence some of those decisions and where they're coming from, and kind of hear their take on it, not just assume or hear through the grapevine. And also so I can contribute to existing literature and resources that can hopefully in the future, or well, maybe even right now, but probably future, help mitigate seawater intrusion and other complex water management issues, because there's always going to be a lot of people involved in, well, with water, as we all know, or well, if you don't, it's very political. And people get upset when you take it away, or if there isn't any, and you're trying to find it. Now, this brings us to my study site. Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project. As I said, it's referred to as CSIP, so it's a little easier to say CSIP. I think I'm going to go with that a little bit more. It's located in the Salinas River Valley Watershed. We're all familiar with California. It's pretty close to us here, next to Monterey, if anyone is not too sure. The distribution system was completed in 1998. And at that time, or previous to that, I should say, all of the farms were individual. They had their own individual wells. There was no continuous system through it. Now, the catalyst for this is the fact that the wells were already becoming saline, and they needed to find a solution. And with that, they had recycled water, and they blended it with their sources. Now, as a little history lesson behind the scenes of the CSIP starting in 1998, one of the things that was helpful for having that source already there, they just needed to make that distribution system and create it, is the Monterey Regional Water Pollution Control Agency, MWRPCA. And that was created in 1972, where the intent of that was to consolidate all of the local treatment plants, which was 8, well, maybe not all of them, but there was 8 of them, and to consolidate them to address the issue of the discharge into Monterey Bay and making that, helping that problem. So when the time came when they were looking for the water source, they did a lot of research, a lot of outreach, a lot of communication, and lo and behold, it ended up working out. So this is one of the sources where they treat the water. MRWPCA is the lead agency for, well, they are the ones who treat the water. They're also in charge of, once the water is blended, the actual distribution system itself. So it's just a little background on that. Now, some information about CSIP. It's about 12,000 acres of farmland. There's 45 miles of pipeline for the entire system. So it's a confined little system, but it's important. And it's known as the largest distribution system of recycled water for irrigating food crops in the United States. Now, some of the typical crops grown, you got artichokes, broccoli, all the way down to, well, strawberries, just like I had in the beginning, looping it back around. Now, get into doing the slide wrong. Now we get into this graph showing the water demand. Well, as I mentioned here, this is with the start of CSIP. So, well, there is no water use data because before that there was no distribution system. So here we have the start here, and you got the rise, you got a couple dips. But what this is showing is now you have the trend of the water demand is actually increasing over time. And one of the major factors for that is now they have crop rotations throughout the year. So they have harvesting throughout, whereas prior to that, prior to the last number of years, they had less growing during winter times. Now, there's also a large increase in strawberry production, which is very water intensive, which also adds to this. Another minor note, I'm not going to go too much into it, but another issue that deals with water demand is more of the demand in the moment is water storage. The water storage is extremely limited. They have an 80 acre foot storage pond where the water gets blended before the distribution system, but once it's in there, it's just live. They don't have any reservoirs along the way or any storage to have as a buffer. And of that amount, the 80 acre feet, that's 1 day of water use. Now, we get into, this is the same graph you just saw, except now this is showing what the actual water sources are. You have recycled water, which is the bottom, and as you can see, recycled water accounts for 65% of the total water used. And you can see the benefit of that because that's offsetting what they have to pump from the ground or find water from somewhere else. And, well, it hasn't happened a whole lot. Now here you got the CSIP supplemental well water. Well, what that means is supplemental well water. It supplements the system. These were the wells that were in existence before CSIP was created, and they basically took them offline from the individual farmers and brought it into where it now feeds into the system. So it supplements. Now, starting in 2010, where you have the green is when CSIP was able to get water from the Salinas River. They started diverting the water, and obviously there would be a lot of planning that goes on before that. But once it happened in 2010, well, the drought hit, as we all know. Again, a recurring theme, drought. Well, 2013, essentially there was no water, or at least there was no water for them to divert, so it stopped, at least for now. It's ceased until there's excess of water. Well, at this point, everybody's looking for water, so who knows when that is. Well, they got the ball rolling for getting another source, which is Salinas Industrial Pond water. Now, that was introduced February 2014. That one was kind of more spur of the moment because they really needed to find something after the Salinas River water went away. And one of the issues with that is it's limited supply. They only have so much per day, 3 million gallons, and the water quality is pretty poor. But it gets treated and put into the system, and, well, they have some water. Now, this brings us to the diagram. This is more specific of the seawater intrusion. I showed you the general one before. This is specific to CSIP, where you have a shallow aquifer and you have a deeper aquifer. And this is all within the same groundwater basin. I'm not going to go into much more detail on that, but it's just so you can see it. Another useful presentation of this slide is the fact that you can see, again, with the recurring theme of climate change, you got rising sea levels. That's going to have a huge impact on all of this, regardless of what's going on in the groundwater. What's going on now on top of the actual land is going to be an issue. So showing the seawater intrusion, this is now the aerial view of the extent of the seawater intrusion. These maps here, so you have the shallow aquifer and you have the deeper one. So the shallow one, well, it's easier for people to actually get the water. I should say, obtain the water and pump it out of the wells. Well, these colors, I know that the numbers are really small, but what this represents is the different years of the extent. So the dark area here, that's 1944. That's when it was first started being recorded, started being mapped. And here at the very extent, you have what was mapped when this was created in 2013. So you can see this goes pretty deep inland, and it's not just the growers of CSIP. It's not just their issue. And it also points out the fact that there's plenty of users inland that are creating some of this problem. It's not just the growers that are pulling the water that's directly below them and they're overdrawing it. It's everyone that's in that groundwater basin. Well, that brings me back to the talk of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Now, it hasn't been determined who's going to oversee that and who's responsible for what. As it is for right now, the Monterey County Water Resource Agency, sorry, this is MCWRA, right here is my source, it's kind of small, but they're the lead agency that oversees currently the mitigation of the seawater intrusion. Now, this goes forward to, again, there's all these loops with lack of water and looking at the groundwater basins. And this comes back again to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Is Department of Water Resources, as I mentioned, is the lead agency for the oversight for what's going on in the groundwater basins. Well, they recently released what the critical groundwater basins are in California. As you can see here, we got the zoom in. Well, this right here is CSIP. This is what we're talking about. Well, this is their basin that is affected, that's under CSIP. And going forward, the management is, well, it's yet to be determined, but it's already known that this is listed at a state level how critical this is. This isn't just the grower issue. This isn't just a CSIP issue. This is known statewide that there's issues. And they're generally on the map because of seawater intrusion. The inland ones they're more so for land subsidence, and I'm not going to go into that topic, but generally it's the land subsides because of the water being pulled. There's nothing there to fill the space. Whereas on the coast, you have seawater to fill the space. Now we're going to get into my actual study. So study design, used case study. Well, case study is using basically just everything. It's a complex situation. There's many stakeholders. There's a ton of information, and with that, adding my own research and trying to put it all together and make sense of it. And so with that, or on top of that, the content analysis, it represents a large amount of qualitative data. Well, these are the interviews that I performed that I'll be talking about in just a moment, and condensing it all in a presentation that you're sitting here and seeing. I'm packing it all in a real tight amount, and well, my paper's a little bigger, but well, that's another story. Don't need any of you to read that, well, except for the committee. Now, the survey, I want to get to that. The who, the what, the when. Well, it was 18 growers within the CSIP area. They had to be owners, leasing managers. With that, I wanted the respondents to be the decision makers. They're the ones that either own or they lease the land. It's not just, well, someone who doesn't. Now, of the 18 growers that I spoke with, the land that they oversee within CSIP represents over 75% of the CSIP area. Now, one of the criteria of, or one of the agreements of the interviews was the fact that they would all be anonymous and would not have anything that would show either their name or company, so just keep it anonymous. So therefore, it's over 75%. We'll leave it at that. Now, what happened at the survey? Well, it was a one-on-one interview. They're all recorded. There was 60 questions with 3 sections. You had background demographics, Likert Scale, and open-ended questions. When was the survey? Well, I conducted the surveys. It actually took a full year, 2013 to 2014, with just finding the respondents, being able to schedule it, and it was very appreciated that I was able to get their time to do, well, it was a free survey. I wasn't paying them, so that was was awfully nice, and they didn't have to, but it was great for me and for my research. The interviews averaged 45 minutes and ranged from about 30 to 90 minutes. And now data collection had primary data. Well, primary data is my data. That's what I created. That's me. The secondary data is, well, looking at everything else, basically what someone else created and making sense of it, putting it together. The sample population of who I looked at, or who I shouldn't say looked at, who I spoke with, was purposive sampling, which is basically you purposely sample them. You go out and you seek them and you get them to come to your interview. Well, I attended water quality and operations meetings, which is an advisory committee meeting within CSIP, and it's consists of stakeholders, policymakers, and a lot of the growers. Well, fortunately for me, it was a lot more of the vocal growers, and well, I didn't necessarily talk to all of them, but I got to talk to a few, and from there, what I do is at the end of the interviews, I would ask them for referrals, and it was a great way, it was a great segue into getting the next respondent to participate. And I didn't have to do the cold calls except for the initial call, but once I said, hey, I talked to so-and-so, they referred me, the doors just opened wide open, and it was most of the time. I won't say every time, but most of the time. Now, as far as the data analysis, all 18 of the recordings were transcribed, and from those transcriptions were uploaded into a software called Deduce. From there, did a lot of my analyzing and coding and just making some sense of it besides just listening to an interview. And with that, export it into Excel, manipulate some of the data, and well, here we go. Now, open coding is a method for custom coding and basically in a nutshell, just coding what they said to give a sense of, well, how do you analyze it? How do you look at it? Make sense of it all without just throwing out a couple hundred pages and say that that's it. You can't quite do that. Now, this leads me to the Likert Scale statements. This is the first section of the real questions that I asked, or statements. Now, Likert Scale, you might not recognize what that name is, but we've all been there, we've all done it. It's on surveys. You have a 5-point scale, and in this case, it's strongly agree to strongly disagree. I'd read the statement, they give their response. Well, the first one is information regarding CSIP is readily available and given in a timely manner. Well, as you see, 84% agree with that. Well, one of the major takeaways with this is nobody disagreed. Just everybody was pretty much in line with it. Now you go to the second Likert Scale. Communication is acceptable and positive overall between CSIP growers and the policymakers. Now with here, you got 83% agree that they feel that it is acceptable. However, 6% strongly disagree. So that shows that there is some sense of the communication is lacking. Now you go to the third Likert. Now it's trust levels. What are the trust levels between growers and the policymakers? Is it acceptable and positive? Well, 72% says they agree when you add up the strongly and somewhat. Well, but here, now you have added a little bit more disagreement. You got 12% that disagree about the trust. And seawater intrusion problem. Now,
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you real fast. Could you go back one slide? So 12, you had 18 respondents, right?
yes.
12% of 18 respondents is not it's not a whole number. So it's not a 1 or a 2.
Well, it's one, those are both one person. But that's the percentage out of 18. Yeah, so these are all the percentages out of the 18 respondents. So with the seawater intrusion problem, you see that 89% when you add all of they really feel strongly that there does need to be more proactive work. With that, as you see, there's There's nobody that's saying that they disagree with that. Now, on the final Likert Scale statement, the statement is CSIP needs to be more proactive with their policies and procedures regarding growers' concerns and being more grower friendly. 78% agree with that. They feel that they do need to be more grower friendly. Well, with that, the takeaway with this one is there is a 6%, there's one person that says, well, they disagree with that. They feel that, hey, my interests are reflected in their policies. There is no need for improvement on that. Now, this gets into the open-ended portion, and what I did is I grouped together by subject, so I don't have to run through all of my figures. This one is about acceptance and knowledge of recycled water and alternate water supplies. Now, as I said, recycled water has been used since 1998, and all of the respondents have used the recycled water for either all of that time or a portion of it. Now, 77% of the respondents feel positive about using recycled water, and 72% say that water does not negatively impact their customers. And 1 out of those 18 is the only one who actually had experience using desalinated water, which was outside of the CSIP service area. Now, one of the questions that I asked I thought that was pretty interesting was, if given a choice between recycled water and desalinated water, which would you choose? Well, you have a large amount. You got 2/3 of the people saying recycled water. Well, that was a pretty straightforward question. Well, with the follow-up of that, I asked, well, what if the costs were the same for either choice? Well, now you see some movement in the chart. You had some people that moved to desalinated or neutral, don't know. So it shows that cost was part of their factor in determining which one they would choose. Well, I took it a step further and asked the follow-up to that is, well, what if the cost was 10% less for the option you didn't choose? So if they chose recycled water, then, well, what if desalinated water was 10% less than that? Well, now you see less of the pie is recycled water, and some move to desalinated water, some move to neutral. Well, overall, 55% of the respondents did not change their answer. So that shows a little bit about the fact that, well, cost isn't really the end-all be-all for the answer. So another subject I grouped here is the level of concern regarding seawater intrusion. It's a major concern. 17 out of the 18 said it was a major concern, and I kind of felt this one was maybe just not quite major. So otherwise, I would say it was all of them, but what the person had said was, well, we've got a solution. It's called recycled water. Well, to me, I interpreted that as, well, it's not as much of a problem, not as much of a concern, at least not currently. And I had also asked, well, what's the best way to address the seawater intrusion problem? 56% said 56% said that less groundwater pumping is the best way to address it. Now, another group is the level of concern regarding environmental impacts. Well, this one and the last group, they both reflect my research question as I presented earlier. One of the questions was their relationship with the environment. Do they feel that growers' relationship with the environment is different than those who do not farm? It was unanimous. All the respondents had said that. Well, I have a quote up here. Basically says, well, there's not as many independent growers anymore. Basically alluding to there's more corporations, it's more business, it's not so much the single farmer as it has been in the past. However, that didn't take away from them thinking that their relationship was different. They still said it was different. Now, another level of concern is the acceptance of desalinated water. 77% of the respondents had stated that they were less accepting of desalinated water due to the amount of energy that it used to create it. Now, I'm going to just touch on this one real briefly, but this is attitudes about their water storage. Well, 83% were positive about using recycled water to recharge groundwater, draw it up at a later date. So it would be used as a storage vessel, basically, rather than just groundwater recharge. Now, they were all positive about increasing the water storage. As you can see, depends on the cost, depends on how much to treat, depends what it is, what are you storing. Now, half of them were positive about using their own property for private storage. However, that kind of raised some flags. Some of the responses were, well, how much land are you talking about, and what's the incentive? And as you can see with the quotes, maybe people aren't as familiar with the amount of water and how fast growers actually use water, but as you see here, that they pump 1,000 gallons a minute, 10, 20 minutes, the storage is empty. Now, I asked questions about efficient water use. I'm just going to briefly go over this. This was all self-reporting. I asked them if they thought they were efficient. 94% said yes. 84% said they'd follow best management practices. And now the numbers go down to only half would be willing to participate in a water budget program. Well, to me, the takeaway from this is once you get more regulation and you get down to they have to involve themselves more with being regulated, that that they're willing to participate lowers. Now, CSIP policy changes that are needed. Highest priority. Well, the top two answers was already doing a good job out of five. Five responses had said that. Another 5 had said increasing water supply. Well, that loop keeps coming back with the water supply. And already doing a good job, well, that sounds like there's some good support there. Now, water supply is the greatest concern. 61% stated that in the beginning of the interview, when given the direct choice between water quality or water supply, they chose water supply. Well, this is also in the face of the drought. So obviously that's top priority, that's big news right now, which probably plays into the 61%. As you see here with the quote, I'm not gonna read it. I had time since I've been talking, but basically just says that they need a long-term solution to saltwater intrusion or even having water, period. Now, some of the additional comments, I'm just going to briefly paraphrase this because there's a lot going on, but these were very interesting quotes, I thought, at the tail end of, not the tail end, but the very end of my interview, where I had asked if they just had any additional comments, and it was really nice that they actually spoke up and said a lot at the end after we already had been talking for a half hour plus. So here you have the importance of recycled water. It was interesting to see what this person had said about the fact that recycled water is something that we should all be doing, and we all recycle it anyways. Now, public education is another component that, well, I didn't really talk about it much. The grower brought it up on their own. I thought that was excellent. I brought it up at the end. Public education is key. There's not enough of it. Generally, when it is, well, it's negative. And then they're thankful for CSIP. So in the beginning, there was huge opposition from this grower and didn't want it and tried to make it go away and just kept going round and round. And he was vocal about it with me, which he didn't have to. But as he says, in the end, he's glad they did. It's been a savior, and it was very interesting hearing that. And planning for the future. Well, they need to plan for the future. What's happening beyond now? And this loops back again to what I've been talking about with the with the global climate change and local climate change. So it's beyond what's happening right now in front of us. This leads me into the conclusions. Now, this is the answers to my research question. The first one, what factors influence growers' acceptance of alternative water supplies? Well, the information availability. It does not equal an increase of awareness or acceptance of the growers simply just because the information's out there. One doesn't necessarily equal the other. 17% of the growers answered that they were not aware of any alternative water sources that CSIP was going to implement. However, at the time of the interviews, they were actually already in the process and starting to implement the Salinas industrial pond water that I spoke of earlier. And also beyond that, the Likert Scale statement about the information. 15 out of the 18 had said that they agreed that, that the information was available and given in a timely manner. And at the same time, nobody disagreed with that. So the overall perception is that it is timely, but that doesn't necessarily equal the acceptance of the growers. The availability of the information itself is not enough. Now, with the communication and outreach, that impacts the awareness and trust. So in separate questions, 10% it said that they wanted more communication and outreach. And in the other Likert Scale question about communication, as I discussed before, that they had disagreed and had said that there does need to be more communication outreach. And 12% had stated, as I mentioned before in the Likerts, that the trust levels were low between the CSIP growers and the policymakers. The perception is that the growers want more communication outreach, and that some of them do feel that it's not there, and that does impact their trust. It goes hand in hand. Now, for the need for water supply, the perception of that the water is in high demand, then their acceptance of an alternative water supply becomes more open. They need to fill the crisis of the demand for the water. However, once it's known what some of those impacts are, then that acceptance goes down. So as I had mentioned, actually I didn't mention this, sorry. 89% when asked if they were in favor of using desalinated water to augment their supply, were positive about it. However, the follow-up question to that was, are you less accepting of desalinated water because of its high energy use? Well, 77% said yes, they are less accepting. The follow-up to that is 61% had said that they were less accepting of desalinated water due to the other environmental impacts associated with desalinated water. So the acceptance falls off once you get down to the need for water supply is met a little bit more. Now, cost is always going to be one of the factors. This is part of their business, part of their livelihood. It makes sense. Cost is a factor for all of us. However, cost is not necessarily the number one factor that's involved in their decisions or what their acceptance is of water supplies. And that was seen when I had asked about the choice between recycled water and desalinated water being 10% less. And the 55% of them did not change their answer. So that was straightforward about cost, without getting into any other points of the program that would take to get that water to them. Now, the perceived address of grower concerns. The perception of the grower concerns impacts their acceptance, and 72% of the growers said more proactive work for seawater intrusion. That is a significant item right there, because it's a large majority, and they're voicing themselves that's a high concern, and they want their concerns to be known. Another point is 78% had said that the CSIP needs to be more grower friendly with their policies, and to essentially hear the growers and reflect some of the things that concerns them. Now, water use regulation. As I mentioned, I touched on it briefly, but this was the part where I had just asked the self-reporting questions about water use, and as the questions got to be where there was more involvement with oversight and regulation, then the acceptance or the willingness to participate lowered at each step as they got more involved with the process, and they were just straight black and white questions. Nothing more involved than that. Now, the final thing to take away from all of this, the big ticket, there needs to be two-way communication between CSIP and the growers to create that trust and acceptance between the two. And that is crucial for moving forward and with now and in the future. That leads me to the second research question. How does growers' level of concern regarding seawater intrusion and environmental impact affect their attitudes toward different water supply options? So the first part, seawater intrusion. Well, as I stated before, 94% felt that seawater intrusion is a major concern. That's top of their list, and it came through throughout the interview. 56% said the best way to address it was less groundwater pumping. Reviewed that earlier. And 89% of the growers had said that CSIP needs to be more proactive with policies regarding seawater intrusion. Now, onto the environmental impact. The growers expressed a strong preference for minimal impacts for water sources that are being considered to be implemented. Now, 77% were less accepting of desal, and I also mentioned that 61% was the environmental impacts. And it also relates back to all of the growers said that they had a different relationship with those that don't farm. Well, that kind of ties into the whole big picture point of the fact that their business is the environment. There is that tie, regardless if anyone says it. So if you degrade the environment, especially around where they're farming, then you're directly impacting their business. So it does make sense that the environmental impact would be a part of their opinion of different policies and going forward with different water solutions. Now, with that, CSIP needs to, or if there's other groundwater management that occurs with the oversight of the critically overdrawn groundwater basin that I discussed before and with the act that's passed, whoever the policymakers are really need to look at this and keep this in their process of deciding what direction they're going with policies or with water sources. No matter what it is, it needs to involve the seawater intrusion in a positive way and have minimal effects on the environment with their choices. Now, this leads me to recommendations. Well, history needs to repeat itself. This is as I even stated in the very beginning, this is a successful program. If you follow what's happened in the past, the policymakers and those that decide need to look at what happened before, just follow that route if at all possible. Now, managing the groundwater basin, that gets complicated. There's going to be several stakeholders involved in that, and that's still yet to be decided. The groundwater recharge should also be used to replenish the water. Now, seeking assistance from surrounding areas is crucial. As I mentioned with the aerial view, it's more than just CSIP that's involved. The seawater intrusion is coming inland, and they need to share resources and costs. And there needs to be long-term solutions. There needs to be more sustainable long-term solutions that will hopefully offset other future impacts, global climate, local climate change, it could be on a global scale, and future droughts. Now sorry.
Can I ask a question though?
Yeah.
So you talked about groundwater recharge with recycled water as if it, kind of an idea or a thought, but is there anything actually happening with that right now? Are they trying to do anything towards that? Or is it just an idea that they're discussing?
So they've looked into, CSIP has looked into recharging the water before when they would discharge in the winter when there was less year-round growing, but Department of Public Health looked at it and they did not approve at that time for it because there was also the politics of, well, whose water is it after it gets put in? Now, a lot of things have changed and other people want water and there's different politics that are happening, but as of right now, there is no groundwater recharge. There is a program, Pure Monterey, that's looking into groundwater recharge, but that's a whole separate topic. So there is some looking into that. To summarize, it's it's critical to incorporate what the growers' needs and wants are. That doesn't necessarily mean that you just go ahead and do it. You need to figure things out. You need to come together, and one of the bigger points is to come to the table and have two-way communication between policymakers, stakeholders, and the growers, and have their concerns and interests in mind in decision making, and not just necessarily be about cost. And I'm sure there's other factors that are not included with what I had said, but to me, the grower acceptance of the program just helps build positive between both in going forward, and it essentially helps everybody in the end. And with that, incorporating what the environmental impacts are, and at all times keeping the seawater intrusion as one of the determining factors of decision making. So with that concludes my research and my presentation. Well, I guess it doesn't quite conclude it, because I'm going to go into acknowledgements. I didn't necessarily want to get specific to individual people, because I didn't want to necessarily leave anyone out. So I kind of grouped them as groups. So I want to thank my thesis committee. This has been a huge learning process for me. And it's been very helpful with all coordination talk between them. The 18 growers respondents for participating in the survey itself. The Bay Area Environmental Safety Group, I was awarded a scholarship in 2014 that helped with some of the costs involved going there back and forth and other things. CSIP policymakers and stakeholders, faculty, staff, fellow students, San Jose State, and friends, family, and coworkers. Thanks everyone in attendance. I really appreciate your time. This has been a great learning experience. That's the best way I could sum it up. Thank you. Wait.
We have to start with questions from the thesis committee before opening it up, so that we can go on. We'll hand it up to Al first.
Jason, thank you. So I got a bunch of questions for you. The first question is, so you talk about recycled water. The question is, where is it currently coming from?
The MRWPCA, the Monterey Regional Water Pollution Control Agency.
But where does the water?
Oh, the water that goes to the wastewater that goes to them. Yes, that comes.
So they're recycling water from somewhere.
Right.
Where is that water coming from?
Right. The source of that is from Monterey. That's residential water use.
Is it the same aquifer?
Yes.
So it's the same aquifer. So we're pumping water out. We are losing a bunch of it because you don't recycle 100%. And then we're putting some of it potentially back in. Right? So net we're losing water from the aquifer.
Mm-hmm.
We also have other problems in terms of losing the water from the aquifer. So the math on using recycled water, I'd like you to elaborate on that.
And maybe one way to think about that too is where did that wastewater go before too?
Right.
Right. And that's
Okay.
So thinking about this as a whole water system, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just recycled water that magically comes from somewhere off system, right? It's all in the same system.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right. So I don't have an easier way of getting this. I was going to show the map, but so as with everything with water, it's political, right? So
I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about, so there is a physical problem of lack of water. There's a physical system that you're dealing with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the farmers are saying recycled water is going to, the farmers are convinced that recycled water is the way to do it. the math just doesn't stack.
Right. Well, in the position they're in, yes, that they ideally do need to get another water source. As it is right now, that's offsetting what's not being drawn from the groundwater below them. Now, this was set up years ago as far as the actual, so like as I mentioned, 1972 is when this was created. So they've had treatment since then. They've had the potential since then. The real use happened in 98, and so what it is now is it's another water source that Monterey and the local area is looking at. They want to use it, not the growers.
I don't think you understand what I'm saying.
Okay.
It's not another water source. It is being drawn from that same aquifer.
True, but the wastewater, it was a once-through system before, like the rest of coastal California, where they just take the water and they put it in the ocean.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
So in some ways, I think it is somewhat close, but you're right, there's there's definitely a math problem of like system expansion.
Yes, for the whole system, there's a clear mathematics problem.
Oh yeah, no, it is.
Which links to my next question. So you've said the words climate change, and I've asked you several times to really specifically examine California climate change and why is California climate change specifically tied to this problem, and I have not heard that. So I would like you to take the specific California climate change projections, all of them that relate to this, and explain why, in the context of California climate change, this is going to be a substantially bigger problem than it is today.
So there's several factors with the climate change. As I mentioned, you have increased temperatures, right? So that's going to affect the amount of water that needs to be used, not only by the growers, but you have everyone else that's pulling up from the groundwater. And in the same sense, in the same moment, you have less rainfall, or potentially less rainfall.
That's not what's projected.
Okay, well, it could be sporadic. It could go one way or the other, but it could be less rainfall. It could be more. Also, you have sea levels rising, which complicates everything. You have increased salts in the soil. You have the potential for the increased seawater intrusion. So with those are really some of the major impacts. And then beyond that, you have population increases. You have more people that have more demands. So it ends up coming down to there's less and less that is available to each different group, whether it's urban, agricultural, and on top of that, you have an increase, like I showed with the water demands going up for the growers, and that goes the same for urban as well. So the whole thing, the whole process kind of goes to the negative, less water and more demand in all sense.
Question. So one of your major conclusions was around trust and communication, and prior to that you had said, well, one of your questions to them was about information. It's never been clear to me what is the communication and information that has to be exchanged here. What specifically are we talking about? Like what kinds of information do you think led some to be, to call that out as an important topic, I guess? What kinds of information, what kinds of communication?
Okay. So one of the responses I had was the fact that there were, I believe it was 17%, was not aware of any sources of any alternative water sources that CSIP was looking into implementing. However, like I said, at that time, literally when I was giving the interview, it was being implemented. So they didn't even know about it, and it was already to that point. So that's part of the communication, part of the outreach. And that to me was one of the big red flags. I don't know what the best solution is to that. But to me, it was kind of odd to see the fact that it's already happening, but they didn't even know. So there's a gap somewhere. I don't know exactly what the answer is to what that outreach is, or maybe that grower or those growers are not listening, you know, or maybe even just at the moment in time when I asked them, it wasn't there. Because, you know, it's in person, it's live. So, you know, right on the spot. The other thing is with all of these interviews, I didn't give them the questions before. So when I asked them, it was live, which, you know, shouldn't really change the answer, but it could be something where maybe, you know, 10 minutes after the interview, they go, oh, that was, I didn't even think of that. Should have been that. So
two more short questions. One is related to, do you have any information about what the rate of water extraction was from CSIP growers, from groundwater before CSIP? So you have some information, it looks like, on groundwater since CSIP, but I think to illustrate, you know, what the overall effect on the system, the CSIP system, has been, or the implementation of CSIP, it would be nice to characterize what, you know, how much was coming out of the ground before CSIP, and what did that rate fall to? So that would be the first question. Do you have an answer to that?
yeah.
You do? Okay, good.
Yeah. Oh, okay, so it almost sounded like you were going to go to number two. All right, so you know, I really try to do my best to consolidate this within the time. So the answer to that is so going forward with the groundwater management is going to be a huge change, because as it is now and how it has been, there is no metering of the wells. There is no metering of anything, and actually there's no cost except for the actual permit to have the well. Now, with that, there are some that are self-reporting that are outside the area, and they may have had some that were before, but it wasn't something that was readily available because the MRWPCA keeps it from when they were when they took it
on.
on.
So can you basically say that the recycled water is the same amount of water that was otherwise being extracted from?
Well, it offsets it to that point of the 2/3,
Okay.
right, that they're using, this right here.
Okay, that's good. So my last question, and then I'll see if Pat has or Alex has any more questions, then we'll open it up, is related to your conclusion. So go over to 45. So you basically say that I somewhat disagree with the finding that farmers are somehow connected more to the environment and therefore more better environmental stewards, because, I mean, I can see why maybe, first of all, they could have decided that the high energy use in desals relates to cost. And maybe that was ultimately their interest in saying, hey, we don't want this because of cost. Because I don't see growers, and this is a exchange we had earlier in the week, I mean, are these growers using drip irrigation?
Yeah, some of them.
Some of them are, okay. So they are using some best water practices. Have they decided to, you know, are they following all the best management practices for nitrogen runoff into the Salinas River? So I'm a little bit hesitant to accept your conclusion that growers' concern for the environment really affects anything ultimately. I mean, they're growers in a complex economy being squeezed by the inputs they got to buy and the low price that Walmart and Safeway are willing to pay for their crops. So in some ways, I'm hesitant to accept your conclusion that environmental impact ultimately shapes their supply. So I don't know if that's a comment or a question, but that would be my hesitation for accepting this conclusion.
Okay, I felt that it was a theme throughout. Some of it can be incorporated with costs, as you said. In talking to some of them, and this is again something that I had to cut out, is the fact that I had a few of the respondents say that when the question came up about efficiency, that they said, well, this is my business and I need to be efficient. If I don't, I'm wasting money, or I'm affecting my land in a negative way. And beyond that, there was a question asked, what's their highest priority for growers' impact on the environment? And the number one answer was runoff. Well, that wasn't so much what I'm talking about, because that's leaving their site. But runoff, now you're getting into them being regulated. They don't, you know, as it was shown in my research as well, they don't really care for that. Well, nobody really does. So it's not just them, but nobody really does. And so now you get into those issues of and I even had them literally, they said themselves, they need to be efficient for their own business, and that goes beyond just the environment. So I think in a way it's almost intertwined, the cost and...
I mean, this is specific to what we talked about last time in your practice talk was, so you said 94% said that they consider their water use efficient, that themselves water use efficient, right? That's like, I think if I graded my students, they'd all say they've asked that for the exam, right? They would say 100%, right? So what do you think? If you were to if someone were to independently evaluate them on their water use efficiency, do you think that that 94% would fall drastically or just marginally? I mean, do you...
Well, I
How
think...
do you see their water? Because that's part of this too. It's not just a supply. I mean, this treats this as a supply problem. It's also a demand problem.
Right.
And like, are they willing to start growing crops that use less water? I don't know.
Ditch overhead sprinklers.
Or that, right? I mean, I've driven through this area. I don't know if they're on the CSIP system, but I've seen them in the pond, I've seen them in the rain.
80% of those folks have overhead sprinklers that they run at high noon in the summer.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
Anyhow, I think it's a...
So I just want to touch real quick. One of the questions I did ask was would they be willing to plant different crops or to be more efficient? I didn't include it because it was kind of extraneous. And it's also self-reporting, and I don't have anything to base it on. But the numbers dropped off, and they said, well, we have a certain demand coming from us, from our customers, so we need to keep those crops going. So what's my incentive to not do that? So then it becomes the business thing or what they're used to or what their practice is.
Right. They're going to grow the highest value crop. They're going to grow the crop that their customers want.
Right, or what they're known for. If they're known for strawberries, they're going to continue in that path, and they're going to rotate what they need to in between that to keep those as healthy as possible and keep their business and their land as fertile as possible.
Okay, so let me see if Alex or Pat have any questions, then we'll open it up for everybody. I'm sure there's lots of questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if, in any kind of open-ended questions that you discussed with the farmers, if anybody brought up the fact that they have actually had an allocation from the Central Valley Project. Since this seawater intrusion has been going on in Salinas Valley since the 1940s, in that era of time, we didn't have as much environmental awareness, and so the solution to overdrafted groundwater basins was always interbasin transfer. So they got, they used their political might as much as they had to help get authorization for an out-of-basin project from the Central Valley Project to take water through Pacheco Pass from San Luis Reservoir. It was supposed to go all the way to the coast. But kind of like Las Vegas doesn't have much water from the Colorado River, these folks on the coast only managed to get an allocation in that project for about 15 million gallons of water a day, about 17,000 acre foot, and that needed to be shared on both sides of Pajaro with the growers in Santa Cruz County as well. So it wasn't a whole lot of money and so on the water, which made it a very high unit cost because getting the water from the bifurcation between Santa Clara and San Benito County, they had to build a pipeline for that small amount of water. But I think everybody remembers, I mean, at the time I was, well, actually, at the time of when they were doing the environmental impact statement on that project, water recycling was obviously an option that they had to discuss. It's an alternative to that interbasin transfer. And I was already a used water salesman running around both Santa Cruz and this area trying to get this to happen. And then, as soon as the Clean Water Act happened, very soon, in 1972, that this whole thing started to come together. I mean, EPA was kind of forcing all the small discharges in the regional plants so they could manage those point source discharges better. And so that kind of made this happen. The other side of the county line up in Santa Cruz, it really kind of blew up. It actually blew up in my face because I was writing the county's wastewater management, EIR, and when I suggested that this was an option, that they could take the water from the Santa Cruz area and pipe it down to Watsonville to do a very similar type of project there, the county supervisor jumped up and called a personnel session and got me thrown out of the county for being a biased consultant because I was such in favor. And he had promised these farmers he was going to get in this water without really realizing that politics wasn't there to sign the contract, the unit costs were too high, and that this was a much more local alternative that we should have supported. And so he kind of covered his butt that way by, making a big scene out of me and making me the strong man. But the fact is, this has all kind of been like 7 decades in the making. And these people were so anxious to get an alternative water supply that they were still, checking out my report 40 years after the fact to see whether, yes, can we really do that? Can we move water from Santa Cruz south toward Watsonville and kind of mirror image what was being done in this project? So, I mean, there's been a lot of, it just hasn't been a slam dunk. And then the other side of the coin was they had to do a huge health effects study to assure the growers that this recycled water was not going to harm the marketability of their crops. And that went on for 2 or 3 years before anybody signed any of these contracts because they were going to irrigate fruits that were grown to be eaten raw, like those strawberries in front of you. So, all of this is, I mean, you can't put politics aside and just kind of deal with the realities of the situation, because the politics goes really deep. And people are always kind of covering themselves. And I had a really good example in my own career of how that impacts what kind of water resources we develop. I don't think there's anything more political than water.
All right.
And so, you addressing these farmers' concerns and how they accept or don't accept this as a water supply, it has got deep background that I doubt came out with your series of questions, unless, like I said, it came out in kind of unsolicited comments in your open-ended questions.
Yeah.
Did you get any feedback at all on importation as kind of a third alternative water source, and whether they regret that, or now looking at the fact that the Bureau of Reclamation has zeroed out all their ag deliveries in the last 2 years and probably this year south of the Delta as well?
Yeah.
Why would the people who did sign those contracts are paying for empty aqueducts now? So maybe they're glad that they didn't have this.
Yeah. So for me, I think what's interesting is the timing of my interviews, because it was during the drought. So, as you said, it's super just beyond political. Well, it gets even more heightened when you have a drought, because now there's nothing available. No one's going to let you borrow money out of the bank that they don't have, because they don't have it. So at that point in the interviews, like I had mentioned with the Salinas industrial pond water, essentially that's all that was available to them. They got cut from the Salinas River water, so they had a source actually taken away. Well, at that point, everyone around them, well, they're looking for water. They don't have water. There's nothing available. If it was available, well, they're going to try and get it. And so everybody's kind of just trying to reach for the water rights or the agreements to get the water.
Whose water right is it to pump out of the Salinas River? When did that get certified?
So they actually went online 2010. I'm not sure exactly when they got all of the contracts in line to actually do that, but as you know, with the planning process, I mean, it's got to be a couple of years.
Whose water right is it?
CSIP?
Oh, that's Monterey County Water Resource Agency, MCWRA. So they're the lead agency regarding the fight against seawater intrusion. And so they're right now, they're kind of the big water manager. They don't actually necessarily execute everything, but they have oversight. So they have oversight over MRWPCA and basically what goes on in that watershed and that groundwater right there in that location. So they created the rubber dam diversion facility, and that takes time. But like I said, they finally got everything in line for. They could only be in operation from April to October, and once the winter time came, they're cut. And a lot of that was Department of Fish and Game. So as you know, you start getting involved with things, there's multiple layers of interaction that's involved. Even if one agency carries it out, they probably had to coordinate with 5 others to make something happen. So So again, just going back to the original part was, I think at the time of this interview, it's very critical to know that it's in a drought time. They happen to hit a point where they lost one of their sources. Now they're getting the lesser of the wanted, if you will, quality of water with the Salinas Industrial Pond water, where pretty much everybody else is like, well, we'll get rid of that. You guys can, have that. But to them, it's still good. It still offsets the groundwater that would be drawn, which is really how I think the positive of that should be seen, is that much water, even if it's a little bit, is that much less that's not being pumped up.
Okay, great. The committee needs to step out while you take the rest of the questions while we wait
Okay.
to our deliberations.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I think your presentation was really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing this knowledge with the rest of us.
Oh, thank you.
Agriculture and recycled water is a big topic that, everyone's kind of talking about now, because we really do want to offset direct potable use in agriculture fields, and we know that recycled water is capable of handling, crops are capable of handling recycled water. Before I came in, I was really interested in learning about weather-based controllers, if any of the farmers were actually using this on their fields during the interview, and were you able to see any of them?
So